Gary.
Hi, Lulu. Thanks for chatting.
Thank you. It's so great to have you. And it's such a delight and an honor to be speaking with somebody that's been awarded and the work made such a difference here. You wrote The Science of Premonitions, many other books, but I want to discuss this one today with you. And you're also the former editor of the Alternative Therapies in Health and Medicine.
Exactly.
Tell us about, first of all, let's start with premonition. How is that different from intuitions?
I don't think it's a great deal different. As a matter of fact, some people are somewhat uncomfortable with this notion of premonitions. You know, they think it's kind of new age woo-woo and all of that, and so they're much more comfortable with the term intuition. This is particularly true in business, where people talk about business intuition or business sense, but they get a little nervous when you say you're using premonitions in running your corporation or making business decisions and so on. But I don't think you can separate premonitions and intuition. I think there's a tremendous overlap.
Okay, so tell us about some of the misconceptions about premonitions then.
Well, the biggest misconception, particularly from people from the science tradition, is that they're impossible. They cannot happen. You cannot know the future. It's the old everybody knows argument. Everybody knows that that's impossible, right? So it can't happen. This is the biggest misconception of all. It's a misconception because of the evidence from two sources. One, people's experiences. Surveys show that over 70% of people in America have had some sort of premonition in the past, in dreams or waking intuition, whatever term we want to use. And also, the other reason this is a misconception is because of that interesting little four-letter word called data. The evidence from actual experiments now overwhelmingly confirm the notion that we can see into the future. If this sounds strange and crazy to people who bump into it for the first time, I would just say, well, that's very unfortunate. But we're just going to have to suck it up and get over it because the data is not going to go away. Besides that, it's becoming more abundant all the time. And so maybe, we could talk about at some point what this data looks like.
Yeah. First, tell us about how you define premonition then. Mm-hmm. What is your definition? Because for a lot of us, I think there's a bit of a negative connotation, like a warning that exists, and it's kind of scary even to look at it.
Well, it is scary for some people. That's no accident. The literal meaning of the word premonition is forewarning. So that sort of gives you a clue of the flavor of a lot of premonitions. They actually give us a heads up about some things that are coming down the pike that may be very unpleasant. They may be threats to our health. They may be physical danger of various sorts, like an automobile accident that may happen, and so on. But that's only one side to premonitions. It's a valid side, but there's some pleasant stuff as well. A lot of people have premonitions about meeting soulmates, lovers. Annunciation-type premonitions of pregnancy are very common. A lot of people have premonitions about job promotions. I even have a series of letters from people who have had premonitions in their dreams about winning the lottery. Some people have premonitions about what the winning numbers in the lottery are. I've also collected a lot of comments from people in the business world who have used premonitions successfully to make fortunes. Donald Trump, George Soros, Oprah Winfrey are all on record as saying that they owe their success to the use of intuition and premonitions. So it's not all forewarnings about unpleasant things. People have premonitions about the nice stuff as well.
Yeah. So we'll speak a little bit more, because I think a lot of us want to hear how we can develop it, or how can we get in tune with it. And you explain that also in the book. I mean, just being in contact with so many people, and yourself have premonition. So, but what is the scientific proof, and what's the data that you have, and why does it bother the scientist? I mean, because it's black on
Well,
white, right?
exactly. My favorite set of experiments that show that we can see the future are called presentiment experiments. Presentiment means the feeling that comes before the presentiment. These are a series of experiments now. They number about 24. They've been replicated by scientists all over the world. Almost all of these studies point in the same direction. The go-to person in our country who has pioneered this stuff is Dr. Dean Radin, who is the senior scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California. These studies have been published. They're not hiding from anybody. Anybody can look at them. But here's what they look like. They're computer-based experiments. And you're sitting in front of a computer, and this computer is programmed to randomly select an image, a picture, and it's going to show it to you. And this picture is going to be one of two types. It's either going to be a lovely, calm, beautiful, serene image from nature, like a beach scene or a scene from a forest or something, or it's going to be exactly the opposite. It's going to be a violent, awful, grisly type of image, such as an auto accident, carnage in war, an autopsy, or something like this. You don't know what's going to pop up. The computer doesn't, because it hasn't even selected it yet. Now you're sitting there, and the other part of the experiment is that you're having some sort of measurement made of your blood pressure or your skin resistance or the diameter of your pupil, something that indicates stress. And here's the interesting thing. If the image that's going to be shown to you is going to be violent and awful and ugly, before that image is shown, your body begins to demonstrate an exaggerated stress response before the image even comes up, before the image has even been selected by the computer. Your body, your unconscious mind, knows what's going to happen in the future, and your body responds, and you can measure that. And so the question is, how on earth is your body or your unconscious mind able to peer into the future and know what's about to happen? No one knows. But this is one of those things that has been demonstrated in experiment after experiment. Skeptics have doubted this and have gone to Radin's laboratory and hooked up to the computers and everything, and even their bodies demonstrate the exaggerated stress response in anticipation of what's going to happen in the future. This is a fascinating piece of evidence, and I think it just devastates these arguments that this stuff can't happen. I mean, there it is. I mean, we have to live with it and get over it, and then try to understand what model of consciousness we have to make in order to accommodate this.
Yeah.
What model of our minds exists that makes this possible?
Yeah.
And that's where the game really gets into.
Exactly. That's where the crunchy good stuff is. Yeah. We're still battling and trying to prove this when there is the evidence, which is this is very interesting, but that's not, we're going to go deeper than that right now. So what's interesting too is that it also, I mean, I guess it happens from a standpoint too that you have to be open to it as well. So the skeptic also face that, is that of course they're less inclined to experiment it if they think it's not going to happen.
Right. That's a very good point. Skeptics sometimes say they can't replicate these experiments, and sometimes they can't. And I think it has to do with your openness. I believe that our intentions and our belief systems often affect how an experiment will turn out. So that's another part of this. Openness to this helps make it happen. And I think it has to do with the fact that we can set the stage and invite these things into our life Or we can bring the curtain down and say, it's impossible, I don't want to see it, I don't want it happening to me. And it's no surprise that these people often have difficulty experiencing this.
So did you find out, or do you have indications on why and how this is possible?
Well, in the book, I go into several hypotheses about how this may happen. I think it's only honest to say that nobody really knows. Mm-hmm. But I think we've got this business of the nature of time all confused in our thinking. You know, we make this picture of time from our earliest days that says that time is like a river. It flows, you know, out of the past into the present, into the future. It's one way. It never goes in the other direction. And if you believe that that's how time works, you know, premonitions cannot happen. So I don't know of any physicist any longer who believes that time flows. There is this idea in physics that time may be a way of everything happening simultaneously. We only become aware of it sequentially, which gives us the idea that time flows. But physicists are playing around these days with interesting models that make premonitions possible. One is what they call closed time-like loops, in which time may circle back on itself and bring information from the future back into the present, which you would experience as a premonition. This is only one model. Who knows if it's going to prove to be true. The idea is that the old idea that time flows in one direction, which makes premonitions impossible in principle, is just wrong. In the whole history of science, there's no evidence that time flows in one direction, or even that it flows at all. In physics, we're beyond that. My point here is that we're not going to be able to explain precisely how premonitions work, but we do know that there are models of how the universe works now that are cordial to the idea of premonitions.
And that opens a lot for in our lives and about our reality, doesn't it?
Oh, indeed it does. I think it makes the game much more interesting, and it has some shocking, even theological and philosophical implications. For one, it suggests there's some aspect of our consciousness that is just outside of time. So what does that mean? Well, I think it means that there's some aspect of who we are that is infinite in time. So what does that mean? Well, if something's infinite in time, it's immortal, it's eternal. So we get to the idea that premonitions imply that there's something sort of like the old idea of the soul that is part of how we're made up, constructed. So I think that there are some very rich philosophical and spiritual implications of this idea of premonitions. I believe premonitions point like an arrow to the idea of immortality for some aspect of who we are. And I think that's pretty cool.
And I love your accent too. That's pretty cool. No, it is. And what does that mean about our past then? Can we also influence it? Since we can see the future, can we also influence our past?
There are some actual experiments which imply very strongly that we can influence events which seem to lie in the past, even though we assume that the past has already happened and is fixed. This is where the game really gets intriguing and a lot of fun, I believe. I'm just not making this up. In the book, I go into about 24 experiments which show that we can apparently reach into the past and change the past under certain conditions. The certain conditions, are not trivial. I mean, there are constraints on this, but this is not, airy-fairy California New Age woo-woo stuff. I mean, they're solid experiments which imply that we can reach into the past just as we can acquire information from the future.
I would love to hear more about that. um, so tell us, so how can we develop our premonition, our intuition? How can we develop it? What are the conditions? And also would like you to speak about the symptoms as well. Because
Right.
apparently there's some clear distinction of really when it's a real premonition versus just a thought or something that is not that accurate.
Exactly. Well, the first part, how do we cultivate or develop this sense? Uh, I think that there are people who are born with a tremendous sense that's just sort of a given, in the sense that, there are prodigies in almost every behavior that we want to talk about, such as mathematics or music or athletics. There are some people who are just gifted at these things. That's true also for premonitions. But for the rest of us, we can do things that sort of set the stage for this. I don't think that you can manipulate premonitions and just make them happen, but you certainly can do things that sort of set the stage and invite them into your life. One of the best things is to keep a dream diary where you write down dreams just the moment you wake up. This helps them become more common. You pay attention to them more if you do this, and you recognize premonitions when they happen. Also, the number one way of freshening premonitions in your life, becoming more premonition prone, is just simply to learn to meditate. Whether you call it just getting quiet or contemplation or doing nothing, if you develop a practice where you clear your consciousness and you invite unconscious thoughts and perceptions to well up into your awareness, you will be surprised at how much more premonition prone you can become. If you look at the test on who's good at premonitions, the people who score highest on these tests are people who have developed over long practice a meditation practice. There's just nothing that comes close. Keeping a dream diary and developing a meditation practice have to be the top two ways of becoming more premonition prone.
And doesn't it create new pathways also? The fact that by meditating, we start to kind of rewire our brains and changing possibly even our DNA, and increasing our potential, this kind of spiritual, if we can call it potential, our soul to fully express itself and share some useful information with us.
There's compelling evidence that the brain tissue and brain pathways are not fixed. The term that describes that now is plasticity.
Yes.
The brain is a plastic. Neuroplasticity. So certainly meditation does do a lot to increase our mental firepower, if you will, by helping rewire or making circuits richer and more complex. And certainly that's true. As to how you evaluate premonitions and help discard the brain noise or the nonsense and the fantasy from valid premonitions is an interesting issue. I think there are characteristics that really do help us distinguish which ones to pay attention to. One is if they're really vivid. In my own experience and the experience of people I've interviewed who really are good at premonitions, they will say things like, "That was the most vivid dream I've ever had in my life." There's some quality, some people call it numinosity, that just distinguishes valid premonitions from fantasy. One woman told me that the premonitions that come to her that turn out to be valid come to her in italics. One woman said, those that turn out to be true seem like they're lit up from the inside.
Wow.
These are all desperate attempts to try to say these things are in a different category. They just seem realer than real.
Yeah. So they're more colorful, they're more detailed, they're
they
clearer.
Have a sense of intensity, of reality that just ordinary nonsense dreams simply don't have.
And there's a physical symptom too. You're saying when on page 139, you're saying when premonitions are accompanied by physical symptoms, they should be listened to. That's really when we should.
Well, I think that's exactly. I talk about an OB doctor, OBGYN physician in Oklahoma City, who began to have premonitions of when his patients were going to deliver their babies. And this was associated with a severe feeling of oppression in his chest, actual physical discomfort. And it never failed. When a woman was going to deliver, he would have the premonition associated with the bodily discomfort. This became so reliable that the nurses in the hospital began to ask him how he felt as a clue to when their patients were going to deliver.
Wow.
That's just one example. Another is that they deal with death.
Yeah.
Premonitions of death should always be listened to, said Carl Jung, the great psychologist, because he said you should pay attention to them because you may not get a second chance if they turn out to be real.
Yeah, especially reading those stories about this woman saving her baby, for example, and
Yeah.
it's just like it was unexplainable. How could she have known that this window would have, the weather would have been bad, and this chandelier or whatever was above it would have just, if she wouldn't have listened to it, she would have never taken the baby with her, and he would have been dead.
Well, exactly.
And
And
usually
these are,
people around you think you're crazy, right? That's
Yeah.
another thing to talk about on how to handle premonitions.
no, that's exactly right. But let me, before we go on, give another criterion for paying attention to these things. That's if they're shared by somebody else. In the book, I talk about a couple in Manhattan. This was before 9/11, and he had a job in security in one of the Twin Towers, and he began to dream of the towers falling down, and there was chaos, people jumping out of the buildings, and so on. And unknown to him, his wife began to have an identical dream. And one day they just mentioned this to each other and found out that they were having this same premonition of tragic events at the Twin Towers. These were both very intellectual people, and they said, "Oh, it's just one of those funny coincidences. They're just dreams. They mean nothing." And unfortunately, he chose not to pay attention to those, and he died on 9/11. If people began to mesh in their dreams and premonition, this is a strong clue that they should be paid attention to.
So those warnings are really, something we should listen. But it seems like there is also this telepathic kind of multi-dimensional, but also with others in this dimension too that is happening both ways.
No, that's exactly right. Now, an example of that is collective premonitions. In the book, I talk about an event that happened in a little church in Nebraska back in 1950 when they were all saved from death and an explosion which destroyed the church because they had some unconscious awareness that they shouldn't go to choir practice that night. And it was the only time in the entire history of this church where nobody showed up. And that was the night that the church exploded from a natural gas leak, destroyed the church, and if anybody had been there, they would have been killed. But every single member of this church choir, which met on this particular weeknight, found some trivial reason not to go. Interestingly, none of them had any vision that the church was going to be destroyed, but they found unconscious reasons to not go. They were just busy listening to the radio, or they got carried away with housework or homework or something. And it's an example of not only of a collective sense, a premonitory sense, but also the fact that a lot of this stuff is unconscious. They didn't know that the church was going to blow up, but their unconscious seemed to operate in order to prevent them from getting into this lethal situation, which would have destroyed all of them had they gone as usual to the church that night.
Can you show? Yeah. So what were you saying?
The point here, I think, that's very interesting is that we don't have to have a conscious premonition for it to be effective. Yeah. These forewarnings seem to be a huge gift. They operate for our survival. And a lot of people in this field say that it's best that these things be unconscious because we don't spend time arguing with ourselves as if we would if they were conscious. Should I do this or do that? Is this valid or just a fantasy? If it's unconscious, you don't argue with it. You just act. and it's much more efficient if we do it that way. So I think it's a blessing sometimes that these things are unconscious and are not spelled out in neon letters saying, don't get in your car today, don't get on the airplane, don't take that trip. If that were so, we would argue with ourselves, and who knows.
And those are fears. I mean, not to,
yes.
There's a clear difference between fears and premonition.
Mm-hmm.
And also, so what is really the downside for you of premonitions?
I'm sorry,
the downside?
What is the downside? The downside is that, like with any phenomenon of this sort, we can get carried away with it. It can dominate our lives. Just as an example, I know a couple people in my circle of friends who will not even get out of the house in the morning before they look at their horoscope in the newspaper. A horoscope is sort of, someone else's premonition about what's going to happen to you according to your birth date. And so these people can become totally hung up and dependent on someone else's opinion about their destiny. I think this is taking things sometimes to a ridiculous extreme. I think people need to look in their own heart and their own emotional center for what's authentic and genuine for them, and not farm it out to the opinion of other people. That's my own personal opinion, and it's not shared by a lot of people, of course. But I think we can carry this to extreme. When we put all of our eggs in one basket about how we live our life, like, what does my horoscope show, or what was my dream last night, and so on, we can really box ourselves into a corner and make some serious mistakes. I think premonitions should be seen as a single source of information. We should supplement it with reason and logic and analysis and the acquisition of a lot of facts about what's going on in our life and in the world, and not just on the basis of what our dream was about last night.
This was so interesting, so interesting. I'm so happy we got this moment, and you sharing this information, this precious information, which brings another piece of the puzzle. Thank you so much, Larry.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
If there is a last little thing that you would like to say that we haven't said about premonition, please do. There is something that you're working on, or something that is a call to action, please.
Well, I think that the take-home major benefit of premonitions isn't whether we can learn how to win the lottery or avoid danger. Those are all nice things, if they happen. However, the main lesson is about who we are, what our own consciousness is like. And I think the main benefit is the implication of immortality for everyone, that there's some aspect of who we are that's outside of time, that's eternal. I can't imagine a greater contribution to our lives from premonitions than that. The fear of death causes more anxiety and fear for everyone than all the major physical diseases combined. Premonitions provide a way out of that by implying that even though the body may die, consciousness is immortal, it's eternal, it's outside of time. I think that's a fantastic gift.
Thank you. And there's lots and lots of stories and evidence in the science of premonition. So for any of you guys watching and I want to read more, then this is a great book. I loved it. Loved it. Very detailed. Thank you so much, Larry. I wish you a beautiful day.